I just want to just plant one little seed to those who are listening.
Go for it.
I dream about a time when restorationists and herbalists are friends, and herbalists are invited to the times when people rip things out, and the herbalist can be like, "Ooh, I want that and I want that," rather than just composting the whole thing. So I'm just I'm planting that seed that herbalists want that. We want to come scavenge what you're digging up.
Welcome back to Treehugger Podcast, where we embark on a journey of discovery and action at the intersection of ecological restoration, environmental justice, human health, livelihoods, and climate disruption. I am the creator and host, Michael Yadrick, and I'm recording and podcasting on the traditional lands of the Puyallup people, also known as Grit City, Tacoma, Washington, and the Cascadia bioregion. In each episode, I navigate compelling issues in ecological restoration, exploring connections between ecosystems, social justice, and human well-being. Through stories of adaptation and community-powered solutions, we highlight the need for action and collective liberation. Our conversations dive deep into environmental degradation's impacts on health, livelihoods, and biodiversity. I'm immensely grateful for your support in keeping Treehugger Podcast independent. Your listenership and contributions empower me to create content freely and bring you meaningful conversations on a semi-regular basis. Thank you for being part of this journey and championing independent podcasting. In this episode, we talk about plant medicines and how restorations and herbalists can work together. I invited Natalie Hammerquist, an herbalist settled in Washington State, to share her wealth of knowledge and experience related to herbalism and foraging local plants. Natalie has educated so many students through her Adiantum School of Plant Medicine. Her journey began with a degree from the Evergreen State College, where she explored herbalism, plant taxonomy, and food science. Under the guidance of renowned herbalists like Cascade, Anderson, Geller, and Matthew Wood, Natalie honed her craft, integrating aspects of Chinese medicine and Western herbalism into her own practice. Natalie's expertise extends beyond the classroom, contributing to important botanical research such as vascular plants of the South Sound prairies. What I most love about the forthcoming conversation is how Natalie underscores the significance of collaboration between restorationists and herbalists to uphold sustainable caretaking and safeguard plant resources. What's more, you will hear Natalie's deeply personal journey into herbalism, which was catalyzed by her own health struggles during her college years. This pivotal experience led her to explore the multifaceted world of herbalism, where she discovered a variety of approaches encompassing both scientific methodologies and traditional wisdom passed down through generations. Drawing inspiration from historical lifeways, Natalie reflects on the diverse and nuanced practices within herbalism, highlighting the need for a holistic understanding that integrates various perspectives. Natalie offers a glimpse into her forthcoming book, Medicinal Plants of the Pacific Northwest, a guide aimed at enlightening readers on the intricacies of herbalism and natural health. With a focus on practical guidance and visual aids for identifying medicinal plants, Natalie emphasizes the importance of accurate plant identification, particularly through the use of photographs to facilitate proper harvesting and utilization. Diving deeper into harvesting practices, Natalie explores the significance of timing, especially during the spring season when plant abundance is at its peak. She shares valuable insights into ethical considerations, emphasizing principles of gratitude, reciprocity, and respect for the land. Drawing upon Robin Wall Kimmerer's concept of the honorable harvest, Natalie advocates for a mindful approach to harvesting that honors the interconnectedness of all living beings and fosters a sense of responsibility for the wider environment. The conversation extends to the therapeutic properties and cultural significance of various plants such as knotweed, blackberry, and hawthorn. Natalie underscores the importance of balancing the benefits and the impacts of these sometimes overabundant plants while advocating for sustainable harvesting practices. Personally, I've been doing some explorations on a few plants disliked by many other ecologists, such as English ivy. And lately, Crataegus monogyna, commonly known simply as hawthorn or single-seed hawthorn, has been on my mind as well. So, reserving the right to take a little sidebar here to talk about hawthorn, the tree has a long history of use in traditional medicine around the world, including traditional Chinese medicine and Native American herbalism. It is valued for its medicinal properties and its uses to support digestion and overall well-being. Despite its noxious label, some hawthorn has long been known to help heal the emotional and physical heart. It is believed to improve circulation, strengthen the heart muscle, and regulate blood pressure. Hawthorn is often used to support overall cardiovascular health and may help manage conditions such as hypertension, angina, and congestive heart failure. Some of the other medicinal properties include antioxidant activity. Hawthorn contains potent flavonoids, which help protect cells from oxidative damage caused by free radicals. The tree also exhibits anti-inflammatory properties, which may help reduce inflammation in the body and alleviate symptoms associated with inflammatory conditions such as arthritis and digestive disorders. It's also been traditionally used to support digestive health. It is believed to aid digestion, relieve indigestion, and soothe gastrointestinal discomfort. Some research suggests the hawthorn may have mild sedative effects, which could help reduce anxiety and promote relaxation as well. Then there's some antimicrobial properties that may also inhibit the growth of certain bacteria and fungi. This may contribute to its traditional use in supporting immune function and combating infections. It's also important to note that hawthorn holds cultural significance in various cultures around the world as well. Hawthorn is associated with folklore, myths, and superstitions. It's linked to concepts of protection and fertility and love. In some traditions, hawthorn is believed to ward off evil spirits or bring good luck. The trees often feature in traditional festivals and celebrations. For example, in Celtic traditions, hawthorn is associated with the Beltane, a festival celebrating the arrival of spring and fertility. Branches are often used as decorations during festive occasions. The berries are sometimes used in culinary applications, particularly in traditional dishes and beverages. They can be made into jams, jellies, sauces, and teas. And related to landscape and biodiversity, hawthorn plays an important role in ecosystems, providing habitat and food for wildlife. Overall, hawthorn's cultural importance as a symbol, a source of medicine and food, and a component of traditional rituals and celebrations in various cultures throughout history make it an important tree in my mind. So thank you for tuning into this episode. As the discussion draws to a close, Natalie shares some insights into her school of plant medicine and offers a glimpse into her upcoming book release, leaving listeners inspired to embark on their own journey of exploration and discovery in the world of herbalism and holistic health. Be sure to check the show notes for more information about how to follow her, find the book, and there's an upcoming book talk in Seattle on April 18th. Thanks for joining Tree Hugger Podcast again. Enjoy the conversation.
My name is Natalie Hammerquist. I'm a herbalist in Washington State, Seattle and Roslyn areas, and I forage. I'm also an author of Medicinal Plants in the Pacific Northwest, which is coming out on April 1st, as we'll talk about later. I'm a hiker, I'm a rock climber, I'm an avid skier, and I just love the outdoors.
Excellent. Thanks for being here. I really appreciate you spending the time with me today. I know you left it out, but when we chatted earlier, I realized you are a greener grad.
I am.
It's something we have in
Evergreen
common.
State College class of 2011.
Yeah, I think you might be the first greener to be on the show. That's important. I also went there, so omnia exteris.
Yeah, that's actually part of where my plant studies began, is I studied with Federica Bocut at Evergreen. And I took plant taxonomy with her, which is how I got all the nerdy plant knowledge for my book.
Shout out to Frederica. Hopefully, maybe she's listening. Probably not.
I also want to shout out to my main herbalism teacher, Cascade Anderson-Geller, who passed away several years ago now. She touched a lot of people. Some listeners may even know who she is. I always run into people that have studied with her. She was a really amazing activist and herb teacher, well-renowned. And my book is actually dedicated to her.
Oh, is it? Great. Was that like your first taste of herbalism, or did the origin story kind of start before then?
In college, I had a lot of chronic health issues, which is where a lot of herbalists get started. My boyfriend at the time's older brother had a company where he sold herbs, and they were really into like nutrition and herbs. And they got me to try like some dietary changes and some herbs for my kind of chronic health stuff. Chronic fatigue was one of the things I had. And it just changed my life. I had this huge health transformation. I felt so much better. I didn't have to take 4-hour naps every day. And so I just was like, what is this? I must know all the things about it. So ever since then, that was when I was 19 years old. Ever since then, I've just been digging about all the things I could learn about herbalism and foraging and nutrition and natural health. So I'm kind of into all that stuff.
Yeah, I am interested in my personal experience too in autonomous healing. I think you probably know that term, right? It's kind of floats around just that like you can take responsibility for your own health and healing, and you don't have to rely on a doctor or big pharma to kind of dictate how you heal yourself. So I think that's super important.
Yeah, to me, that's one of the reasons. There's a lot of reasons why I wanted to write this book that is coming out soon. One of which is just like educating the masses about herbalism and natural health and kind of putting that more in the hands of people, which is where it originated.
Right. And so I don't know where you sit. I think there's like different flavors of herbalist. What makes an herbalist? Is there like a stereotypical sort of archetype for them?
Oh gosh. I feel like most of us, like probably a uniting factor is that like modern medicine has failed us would probably be the most common thing. There's a lot of different ways of approaching herbalism. Some people are like really science driven. Other people are very like folk medicine driven, which means like more traditional, like coming from the traditions of the past and oral tradition. Some people are like really into essential oils. Some people are like into Ayurveda, which is Indian herbal medicine. Some people are into Chinese medicine. So there's some people joke like the only thing herbalists can agree about is not to use aluminum pots. Forget what herbalist said that. I thought that was really funny. Or how to pronounce calendula, which is not calendula. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways of being an herbalist. And I personally, I love to read scientific articles. I think there's a lot of great science that has been done on herbalism. But I also love to read like historical accounts and go back to like things that were written in the 1500s in like funny language about how herbs were used back then, because I think that there's valuable information to be gleaned from both of those sources. But I think ultimately, like, I'll believe what I see happening in front of me. And so if I see something work, that to me, that's like the highest form of information. So I've done a lot of experimentation on myself and listened to stories from others a lot.
So when you say the 1500s, I think your practice comes from perhaps like your ancestry or whatnot. So there's like herbalism that came from like Europe, and then there's like Ayurvedic traditions, right? So we say 1500s, that seems like a long time ago, right? Like 700 years ago. But then there's like Chinese traditions that go back to 300.
3,000 years ago, actually. Yeah. Ayurveda, I think the original Ayurvedic text comes from 3,000 years ago. And actually Greek medicine, the Greeks were very advanced in their practice of using herbs and other treatments. It's really amazing, actually. I think we have this idea that all of modern medicine happened right now, but a lot of these things are still being used. A lot of these ideas, like Chinese medicine practitioners, like if you go to the acupuncturist, they actually study texts from 2,000, 3,000 years ago in class to treat you, which I think is pretty cool. But my practice, I've done a lot of research kind of in the European tradition, partly because I really believe in like connecting with your ancestors. I think it can be kind of spiritually powerful to do that. But it's also, I love reading like historical accounts of like Scottish herbalists. I have a really good book on that. And I read Nicholas Culpeper, which is one of the big herbals of the 1500s. And that one's fun. He goes in a lot of like rants about things in the 1500s. That's definitely a nerdy subject of mine, is just history and historical uses and ancestral uses.
I think it's important. And so your sort of herbalism, you connect with your ancestry, but then also like you live not where your ancestors lived, right? So you live like pretty close to me. You said Roslyn. I don't know if people know where that is. I would say you're up in the mountains, but like in the foothills
definitely up in the mountains.
of the Cascades.
It's 2,000 feet up here.
Yeah. So I assume you also use the plants that you see every day, like around you, right?
My book includes actually a mix of native plants and non-native plants, which is interesting because a lot of those plants aren't included in my ancestral tradition, but here they are, which is probably something my ancestors who came over here as pioneers did. And a lot of the non-native stuff is actually things that my ancestors brought over for medicine for themselves, interestingly. Like probably hawthorn, which we might get into later, it came over here in the hands of colonists for the purpose of food and medicine. So I talk about that a lot in the book, but it is an interesting thing of what do you do with native plants when they're not part of your ancestral tradition? And part of what I do is actually look at like similar species in my tradition and kind of see what the traditional uses are around that. And then I do get into some native uses, but I actually kind of try to steer clear of that because I think, and everybody can kind of drive their own boat and choose their own adventure in that regard. But I like to leave that to people's own traditions. And I do also delve into some Chinese uses as well. Part of for that is that I think Western herbalism does kind of lack some richness due to the history of like witch trials and like killing herbalists. And I hate to say it, but like the patriarchy damping down that type of knowledge for profit and gain. So unfortunately, like a lot of richness and like layering has been lost in the European tradition that we kind of need to borrow from other traditions to make up for, if that makes sense. That's the way I see it anyway.
No, don't feel bad about saying that. Honestly, I've had some similar thoughts recently. The witch trials going back into like enclosure of the commons and like feudalism and pre-capitalism and the witch hunts. Essentially, for you, what you do wouldn't be allowed a couple hundred years ago. And the reason why I think we're like allowed to do it or practice it today, it's not really a threat to capitalism anymore.
Yeah, I mean, in Europe, the legislation is actually really different. If anybody's interested, they can look that up. But a lot of what we do here in the States around herbalism is actually illegal in Europe. And they require a lot more, like for herbal product sales, they require a lot more research studies to be done on them for effectiveness, which kind of has its benefits, but it also has some major drawbacks in that herbalism is less in the hands of the people. I remember I was in France one time and I was like approaching this like display with homeopathic arnica ointment on it. I like went to touch it and the pharmacist came out and was like, don't touch that. You can't touch that unless you have a prescription. And I was like, whoa.
Really? Huh.
So
fascinating. Yeah, you mentioned your book a little bit. I'm thumbing through it right now. The good people at the Mountaineers sent me a copy. I mean, there's several books on my shelf about medicinal plants of the Pacific Northwest. But this one is cool because it's new and shiny, I guess. But I feel like it really helps to hold your hand through the process for, I would say, a beginner. Who's your audience for this book?
Definitely, like you said, beginners, but I actually have colleagues that use this book. One of my friends who teaches down in Tacoma actually got books for all of her students in her class. Because the previous version of this book, which was my self-published version. But so students of herbalism, but then there's also like a lot of my friends say that there's just good reminders, people that know a lot about herbs already, new ideas about things to use, because I do include some more obscure uses of things in my explanations. But maybe what sets this book apart from the other books on your shelf, which you know, but our listeners may not know, is that it originally was called A Visual Guide to Medicinal Plants in the Pacific Northwest, which we changed the title a little bit. But it actually has cut out full picture of the flower and a picture of the leaf and a picture of the seeds and a picture of the stem and a picture for each plant in it. And so my big intention was to make this really practical and usable outside in the field. So people can kind of like literally compare the leaf to the page and be like, yes, this is what it has. And I include lookalikes in a lot of the things too with pictures, because I just had been frustrated by all the other guides that kind of had one like line drawing of the plant. And then they'd talk about it. And it's like, that's not very helpful. And there's actually like 500 pictures in the book, in case you're wondering. I know, because I had to send them all to my graphic designer. So that took up a lot of time, yes, but also I think it just makes it a lot more approachable for visual learners, and which is basically everyone. And I also include pictures on the making process of medicinal preparations too.
Right. Yeah, a few books don't even have drawings. So I'm on the page on cleavers, right? Like you would imagine a line drawing of cleavers and it just could look like anything. It's just like a bendy stem with these very narrow leaves and the seed head too. The pictures really help, I feel like. Because especially when you're out in the field, like a line drawing compared to a picture is really can make or break deciding whether to pick a plant or not.
Yeah. And I've been teaching for a long time. And so I kind of had an idea of like how people learn, and could see out in the field people using these guides and getting things wrong. And so that was kind of part of my motivation too, to write this book. Because I was like, man, I kind of can see what the issues are and what people need. Maybe I should do this. Maybe I should just write the book.
So the book comes out in April. Mm-hmm. So it's early spring when the episode is about to come out. What are some things people can do during that time of year out and about? It's a busy time of year.
It's a busy time of year. Obviously, a lot of plants are like shooting up at that time of year. The first thing that people should know about like springtime in general is that that's the best time to harvest a lot of the green leafy things. And we're kind of like going into edible plants too, like nettles obviously are up that time of year. Chickweed, which is one of my favorite wild edibles that also has medicinal uses. Dandelion leaves are more like even earlier. You want to get them because they get bitter later on. But then we kind of get into like barks. Some barks should be harvested in the spring, like willow bark. And actually, there's a page in my book that's like a chart with all the months and like what you can harvest in each month. And I had forgotten willow bark is a great thing to harvest in April because it's like super wet and you can literally just peel it off with your hands in these big sheets. And it's like kind of a little sweeter. It's a little less like weird tasting this time of year. And willow bark is used for anti-inflammatory pain, basically. It's just like aspirin. But then the other thing that is in early May, which I think is one of the best things to harvest in the year, is hawthorn flowers. And you can harvest the flowers of our native hawthorn and our non-native hawthorn, which is called one-seed hawthorn. They all bloom at the same time in the first week of May, usually. Think of May 7th. And if you're like further north than us, where we are, like I'm thinking we being Seattle, they might bloom later. If you're further south, like down in southern Oregon, they might bloom earlier. But here they bloom the first week of May pretty much without fail, and they bloom for 1 week. So you really got to catch it at the right time. So if you see them blooming, you like drop everything and run out there. And hawthorn flowers are really cool because hawthorn is actually one of the most researched plants in the world. A bunch of different cultures use it. The Chinese have done a bunch of research on it because it's one of the main herbs used in Chinese medicine. They use the berries more than the flowers. But a lot of the research on hawthorn shows that it's really high in antioxidants, and the highest parts of the plant in antioxidants are like the new leaves and the flowers. And antioxidants, of course, are this like buzz thing because we all are dealing with all this inflammation now. And a lot of the research has been done on cardiovascular disease. And there's actually really good research to show that hawthorn, it does indeed help with a lot of the like typical numbers associated with cardiovascular disease, like the balance of LDL and HDL cholesterol, and 10 different indicators, the strength of the heart muscle, and also like your tolerance to exercise for those already with cardiovascular disease. So yeah, hawthorn flowers are like a super great remedy for anyone dealing with cardiovascular disease. And you can go and read the studies if you're curious.
Yeah, I've been learning a lot about hawthorn recently. And so I want to get to that. But you said something else about bark. Yeah. So I just want to put maybe these two questions together. For folks that are maybe a little timid about harvesting bark, like that's sort of a novel thing, I think, to me. So harvesting bark from like a living tree, is that ethically good to do? Or do you just do it sparingly? Like, how do you make that decision? And then with hawthorn, the one-seed hawthorn in particular, for those restorationists out there listening to this episode, that's a species we often think we just need to like eradicate from our landscapes. Yes. So it comes from that impact-focused perspective of integrated pest management. But many of us are very ignorant of the benefits of the plants. So those are two very separate, different questions. But I want to touch on both of those.
Because I think we can dig into some other things there too. Because roots, I would put in that same category of, oh my gosh, it's a huge impact.
Yeah.
So let's start with willow, because I think talking about different plants, each plant should be harvested and treated differently. Like as far as like how much is good to harvest, like are you damaging the plant? Willow in particular, if you cut off a branch of a willow tree, 10 more will grow in its place. That's just like the nature of willow. And that's why we use it for basketry, because you cut it off, 10 more straight things will grow, right? So willow is one of those things that actually likes to be harvested, and you can definitely harvest it in abundance. And I actually understand that where the places where willow is native, or what some of the places have like lots of herbivores that eat lots of willow, and that's why they're that way. So we can kind of be herbivores for a moment when we harvest willow bark. However, there are other things like Oregon grape. It grows a little slower. We do use the bark of it. And so a few more considerations need to be made about how are we harvesting this. We always cut at an angle, which is true in tree pruning as well. We always use clean tools when we harvest. And I think that it's important to note, maybe don't harvest the Oregon grape that's the nice, like Oregon grape in the parking lot that's like the landscaping. Or like maybe don't harvest the Oregon grape bark where it's the parks don't want you to be harvesting it. So one thing about Oregon grape is that you can often find people that are trimming it. I've gotten a huge amount of Oregon grape bark from just like passing by somebody that was trimming them at the moment and dragging it home. So the low Oregon grape, a lot of people like, but in my opinion, it's like kind of impactful. So I only harvest that because it's a low Oregon grape. It doesn't have a lot of above ground parts. Its habitat is a little more specific. It doesn't get as big. It's kind of one stalk for the whole plant. and you have to pull it up to harvest it. You get the underground part. So it's a much larger impact. That said, there's big patches of it. But the tall Oregon grape, I think, less impactful to harvest because one plant could have 50 stems. And some of them are like 15 feet tall. So what I like to do is just kind of like harvest at a node where there's a little bud with a little tiny leaves on it. So that little bud will kind of grow and replace the branch that you cut. That's kind of a thing that I use for a lot of anything that I'm cutting branches is I think about like, where's that energy going to go that was going up into the branch? Where is it just going to die and disease the tree? So we kind of use some pruning tactics when we're harvesting bark. We think about what our impact is for whoever owns the land if it's not you, what like the aesthetic impact, what the ecological impact is going to be. Because removing branches is just more of a thing than removing berries. I think we can all agree on that, right? And some plants can field that a lot better than others. And so we kind of got to use our common sense when we go into the field. Like we look at the plant. If there's just one stalk and you got to harvest the whole thing and there's only one of them in your sight line, maybe that's not the one you're going to harvest. Maybe don't harvest it at all, right? But if you are harvesting willow bark and you're in a whole stand of willows, I wouldn't feel very bad about harvesting a branch of that because you know that it's going to come back. You know that the tree's going to heal well. And you know that the tree actually thrives under pressure like that. So yeah, there's not like a how to harvest bark's single answer is my summary.
Yeah, I gotcha. Yeah, and I think we're dipping into this conversation about honorable harvest, right? And there's like this checklist that I think a lot of us have in our heads perhaps about like how much to take and what to leave for others, like the wildlife, and leave some for habitat. But coming from our different like little niches of practice, like as a restorationist, 10 years ago, I was like hesitant to touch anything native because we're always trying to like restore some landscapes that are really just don't have much. So installing Oregon grape, sometimes you put one little plant in there. It takes forever to take off and you're putting it into a place where there's really not much of it. But then from a landscaper's perspective or like a park maintenance worker's perspective, you're often managing for aesthetics and you're pruning because plants are sprawling into a sidewalk or into the driveway or someplace where you don't want them. And then from the herbalist perspective, you're looking at plants for like their herbal action or you want the benefits of the berberine in the Oregon grape, right?
Yeah, we kind of have to respect other people's programs too, though, when we're harvesting. Like we got to play others' games, which I think is important because parks have a role and people like to go enjoy parks and aesthetics are important and all that. Yeah. But I think I want to mention too, I don't know if she coined this phrase, but she definitely is very associated with this phrase. Robin Wall Kimmerer, the author of Braiding Sweetgrass and Gathering Moss, 2 great books that are great if you're interested in this kind of thing. She talks about in the beginning of Braiding Sweetgrass what the honorable harvest means. And they're great things. One of them is be grateful. One of them is take only what you need. One of them is use all of what you harvest. And one of them too is reciprocate. And I'll talk about that in a second. So they're great principles. And I think that's a really good place to start if you're getting into it. And I would just like to add, because we're talking about a book for the Pacific Northwest, so we can kind of get into specifics here. Each plant has a way that details on how you can respectfully harvest it, right? Certain plants, pedicularis, for example, you can't cultivate it, which already is like red flag for maybe you're not going to harvest that plant. And it's fairly rare, right? It only grows like in certain mountain habitats. And there's certain species of it that like only grow in alpine meadows on Mount Rainier. So let's not harvest that at all. And then you have plants like Japanese knotweed, which is not in my book, but at some point I might add it there in a later edition, which we want to harvest as much of that as possible, right? But then there's like other considerations like, well, it might have herbicides on it because that's one of the most sprayed plants in our state. And then you don't want to drop any on your way out because you might establish another patch. So what is honorable for each plant can be really different. Versus like mushrooms, you want to harvest them in a basket so the spores are like dropping out and planting more mushrooms as you go. But then there are native plants that are abundant enough for us to harvest, but still do need some respect, like bleeding heart, which is in the book, so you can read all about it. It's an interesting one because there are patches of bleeding heart that are so big. It's an understory plant. It's like sword fern is its friend. It grows in like Douglas fir forests on the west side of the Cascades. And this thing is a spreader. Like you can harvest it and put it in your garden and it will just spread in the shade. But you want to harvest the whole plant which is kind of impactful, right? So it's abundant, but our impact is going to be large. So I think that's a good example of just like harvest 1 in 10 or 10% of what's there, and only if it's a big patch. And then that gets into 2, that bleeding heart is a toxic plant, which we do use toxic plants in herbalism. And I really believe in the fact that I want to educate people on using these plants. I don't think we should be afraid of them, but we also need to use them with caution in ourselves. So there's a lot of different aspects of the honorable harvest, and I'm happy to go into more if we get into it later. But one of the biggest things I teach my students is using your observation skills, because I think a lot of us need to be taught them just because we didn't grow up looking at these things. Like, how much is there? Where are they? Like in my neighborhood, there's some here, there's some here, there's some here. Oh, there's less than last year. Sometimes trees will produce a bunch of fruit one year and then like none the next year. So things like that, if we're visiting the same places every year, it's a little easier. So I always encourage my students to do that too, is make relationships with specific places, which is how our ancestors did this, right? They were harvesting from the same patches year in and year out, and their grandparents harvested from those places. So they know to watch for certain things and watch for certain years they might have less, or their impact might be larger, and so they stop harvesting those things. So these are things that I really want to reintroduce into our awareness as people who are participating in ecosystems.
Yeah, you touched on a lot there. So I'm just trying to pick away at a couple of the threads. I think that the fluency and the words you use it can be somewhat different than what restorationists use. It's like practicing gratitude and what does a reciprocal relationship look like, and the perspective of what's abundant and not abundant and what you leave for others. So in particular, like thinking about weeds, the quote unquote weeds that show up in your book, like the blackberry, the fennel, the St. John's wort, those are often species, or those are often individual plants that we just don't want any of. So this is a question I actually received over email from one of my colleagues like a couple of weeks ago. I was like, how do we practice honorable harvest related to weeds? And I bounced back like a couple like response. I didn't get anything back from them yet. So maybe they're sitting with it and meditating with it. But I think it is something that like I'm thinking about, and maybe others are as well.
Yeah, you're going to get a lot of different answers from different herbalists and different harvesters on this, FYI. But so I'm going to tell you mine.
Yeah, and also the definition of weed too, because I told you, I think a while back, is some people consider alder weed, or there's like different shades of...
It's not. It's an essential pioneer species of a very important ecological system. Blackberry, however, I think we could all agree is not a team player. And to me, that's the wording I like to use. Is the plant a team player? Is it benefiting other species, or is it maybe harming other species? In the case of Himalayan blackberry, I think anybody that's been part of any restoration project, like in any capacity, can understand that Himalayan blackberry is not a team player, right? There's people that would argue that, but I think most of us will agree on that. And one of the reasons is that it basically shades out everything else and doesn't allow anything else to grow, right? Other plants actually use chemical warfare. Himalayan blackberry is just can grow so much faster than everything else that it's just going to win out, right? And so as a forager, I'm like, all right, I'm going to harvest as much of that as possible then. That's why like the 1 in 10 principle that a lot of foraging books say, I don't necessarily agree with for certain plants. I think it's a good starting place. But for Himalayan blackberry, I'm like, you get out there, and blackberry root is one of the things that's in my book. It's like, you get out there and dig more than you need. Do as a public service, like chop off a bunch of things. Maybe in the park that is responsible for that, maybe they don't want you doing that. If it's in your yard or in your neighbor's yard or in a piece of land that you have autonomy over, I'd be digging up those roots right and left, because it makes it easier for trees to establish and for forests to grow. So that's kind of my take on that one. I have different takes on other ones like hawthorn. And St. John's wort is one of those ones that I like. That's a chin scratcher for me, because St. John's wort is one of the most important European plant medicines. It's a pretty cool herb. Right now, people are using it for its antidepressant capabilities, which there's been research on. FYI, it has a lot of interactions, so proceed with caution, drug interactions. But it can be a really great plant for those dealing with depression. It also has a history of use for like bladder diseases. People are using it as sunscreens. It's like good for wound healing. It's an amazing plant. And I think that it's become considered invasive based on my research is that it invaded farmland and livestock started eating it and they started dying. And that's like number one way to get on the invasive species list is you start interfering with livestock production and you're done.
I think for most noxious weeds, like threatening any aspect of capitalism, like the economy, harm to the economy, harm to livestock or like agricultural production. Yeah, those are the ways you get on the hit list.
But I want to hear the argument that St. John's wort is making a negative ecological impact other than harming cows. Like, I'm really curious. I'm open to hearing it. I haven't heard it yet because when I see it growing, it doesn't seem to be like it likes habitats that other plants don't. It'll grow in like a scrubby, gravelly field or like on the side of the road where like other plants don't enjoy. But it's St. John's wort is an interesting one because it actually, the very first biocontrol, which is basically introducing another species to control an invasive species, was used. And that was on the Klamath beetle or Klamath weed beetle, which is another name for St. John's wort. And they introduced this beetle to basically like predate on the St. John's wort and eradicate it. So if you are out harvesting and you see these shiny black beetles on your St. John's wort, that's what that is. It's like a human introduced biocontrol. And some patches are like raised by it, which is fascinating to me.
Yeah, I'm learning more about St. John's wort. It's one that we don't mind in the parks. I don't think it's but I think if I was on the edge, like in more of an agricultural community, I think it would be different perhaps. But I would say my first weed I learned about was like tansy, and I grew up with horses, right? I was trained by my mom to go out in the pasture and pick the tansy. But tansy is one of those ones where if there's lots of luscious green grass for the horses to eat, they won't touch the tansy, right? And so it really depends on how the land has been treated. And so if you're pasturing your horses in a muddy field where there's sparse amount of other things to eat, or you're having to supplement with hay or whatever, then they may go after some of the toxic plants that are growing around the edges. I think some of these places it's sort of a symptom of how we've treated the land, I guess, or how other folks have treated the land.
I think, too, something that happens is that certain animals aren't evolved to interact with certain plants. And so they may not be able to, like a lot of animals will put something in their mouth and be like, that's not edible. That's not good for me. And they won't eat it. But there's this horse pasture that I know of that's like full of foxglove because the horses eat everything except the foxglove.
Yeah.
But it's all beautiful because foxglove is poisonous. But St. John's wort and cows, like I think the cows just can't tell that it's toxic because they don't have that like genetic information in them, which is interesting. That kind of concept actually can be expanded to a lot of different things of having these plants that are introduced, not having been here in the past. Some of them, like blackberry is a different story because blackberry is actually human created. But like Japanese knotweed, it grew up in a different environment and it comes here and it doesn't know how to limit itself almost because it didn't evolve here. And that nothing else can compete with it because it has no history.
Yeah, and we do balance like these benefits of some of these plants with their impacts. So for knotweed, like it's just bees go crazy for it. So it can be important for that. Blackberry and hawthorn, right, are in the rose family. I think anything in the rose family essentially is pretty therapeutic or medicinal. But blackberries, that's one that we're just trained to dig up and kind of throw away, right? But you're saying the root and the leaves, obviously the berries, people know about the berries because they shove them in their face all the time. But it's like the root, you're saying roots and leaves are important.
I can't say that they're like the most universally useful things, but I included them in my book because there is so much of it. Let's just put it out there. Blackberry root is used for diarrhea. Like it's extremely astringent and you take it and it will astringe your large intestine and it will stop things up. Okay, which is not always what you need, by the way. That is expelling for a reason. But if you were to take that plant when you didn't need it, which I've experimented with this in my youth, it'll just stop you up. Like you're going to be constipated. It's just straight up. It definitely has a very specific use. It's one of those things that I put in a first aid kit. But astringents are also good for wound healing. They're good for like kind of astringent gums, so they tighten up. They're good for like periodontal disease in general, which normally people would use oak bark for. But hey, blackberry, right? But blackberry leaf is interesting in the kind of typical Western tradition that we have here in the States. Blackberry leaf isn't used a whole lot. Like we kind of use it every so often. But I was working in this herb store in Seattle, Rainbow Remedies, some of you may know it, many years ago. And the Russian women would come in for blackberry leaf. And this one customer in particular, she didn't speak much English. So like I just had to try to communicate with her and we were using hand gestures and she'd write stuff down sometimes. But she told me that in Russia, blackberry leaf is used for diabetes, which is really interesting. And for those of you who don't know, Russia has an extremely strong modern tradition of herbalism. And they still actually print a pharmacopoeia, which is like what we use herbs for, big encyclopedia book every year of herbs. And they have a very just like vital, complex, rich tradition of this. And blackberry leaf is one of the most commonly used herbs there, as it turns out. So yeah, it's interesting to think about this other culture has these uses for blackberry leaf that we don't even know about over here. So that's something interesting for readers to check out. It's very astringent and it's very drying. The whole plant is. So if that's what you need, then great. But like me, I'm a little dry myself. So it just dries me out too much. So it's definitely kind of a specific plant that has some specific uses, but I think it's a good one to know about and to try using. You can also weave, by the way, with blackberry stalks. So that's something else to look up.
Yeah, that's important. I think this cultural uses of plants are important, and the ones we often would think of are weeds that we wouldn't incorporate or would normally just overlook are important. And as land managers, and who knows who's listening to this podcast, but I think some people are land managers, folks are restorationists, depend on how I tag the podcast, like some people may fumble upon it. I think it's important to think about like how we sort of integrate or preserve or listen to the stakeholders or people who are the rights holders or people who are using the space and accessing the space for different things. So yeah, I'm just thumbing through the book a little bit more off and on and just looking at mullein and
there's one. Yeah.
Yeah. Talk about mullein
People
for a second.
spray mullein with
Horsetail. So yeah, if you can talk about those a little bit. Yeah, maybe talk about some of these.
I just want to like just plant one little seed to those who are listening.
Go for it.
I dream about a time when like restorationists and herbalists are friends and like herbalists are invited to the times when people rip things out and the herbalist can be like, "Ooh, I want that and I want that," rather than just composting the whole thing. So I'm planting that seed that herbalists want that. We want to come scavenge what you're digging up.
Okay, good. Yeah, I would say too, in lots of little park spaces anyway, sometimes the foraging has been illegalized, even against, it doesn't synchronize very well with treaty obligations or with reality. And so we've driven their foraging or herbalism underground. And we kind of touched on that at the beginning of the conversation, but there's just those sort of stakeholders are invisibilized, right? We don't know who's using the hawthorn because people do it in secret.
Yeah. I had a thought about that yesterday, actually, which is that, gosh, what government agencies and like public land agencies fear is that people aren't educated and they're going to be greedy and they're going to come and just like harvest everything, which is a legitimate concern, right? Like there is case studies to show that is possible. American ginseng is definitely a good one to dig into if you're interested in seeing about that. But I'm really curious about, okay, so you want people to be educated. Can we create policies that are detailed in this is how we want things to be harvested? And parks are a little different, right? Parks, like a park in Seattle, I can see why you'd want to not have foraging just because there are so many people, right? And that creates a different problem, which is just there's too many people wanting to harvest in one spot. That would be complicated. But I'm thinking about like Forest Service land where there's other people having huge impacts on Forest Service land that's allowed, like timber harvesting and four-wheeling and things that are like documented to be extremely damaging to ecosystems that's allowed, right? And foragers are out there. Technically, some of it's not allowed. Some of it's like unclear. Some forests are like, I don't know. You go in and ask and they're like, I don't know. Or you need to get licenses or whatnot. Anyway, I'm curious about, can we create policies with maybe the lead botanist of the Forest Service and like a team of foragers that actually reflect, okay, we're not going to harvest these plants because they're endangered. And these plants are the ones we're going to kind of recommend that can be harvested here. And here's some general principles. You kind of may start to get complicated, but I am curious if we can, rather than fearing uneducated people coming to do it, can we just make our legislation and rules clear? Because people are going to do it anyway. If you look at salal harvesting, which is a commercial harvesting venture where a lot of people do it without licensure, and that's a big issue, can we just make rules with the stakeholders at the table? Let's get some tribes in there. They definitely are stakeholders in wanting to harvest things on public lands. Let's get herbalists in there. Let's get mushroom hunters in there and see if we can actually like create a document or a policy that is easy for people to understand and protects what we want to protect, which is like endangered or rare native species and species that maybe we shouldn't harvest a whole lot of and more. So yeah, that was a thought I had yesterday. That was kind of a rant. Sorry.
Yeah, that was a great rant. I've had similar rambling thoughts. Yeah, like
We talked about this
at
before.
nighttime while trying to sleep, or on a run or something. I think about this quite a bit. And I don't have all the answers, but in your brain, you have this checklist of things where it'd be like, check, check. And I think to support food sovereignty efforts, as well as these very embedded cultural traditions that have been disrupted. A lot of us may be moving around for centuries and stuff and being disconnected from some of these plants, or living on native where that aren't our ancestral homelands, and trying to get in right relationship with the space. But it may not be at the tippy top priority of a lot of land managers' agendas right now. But I do feel like this conversation, just meeting you, I feel like it's been great to talk about imagining different future possibilities.
I think that's so important because I think a lot of us can get really down about what is, or like problem focused and negative focused. And I think it's so important for us to just invite a better future and ask questions like, can we do this? What if we did this? Because otherwise it's never going to come if we don't imagine what we would prefer rather than what is.
I agree. You talked about imagining different futures or better futures. How can we integrate, I guess, for lack of a better term, like rewilding and ecological restoration? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah. So I became familiar with the word rewilding more from the like cultural context, and just recently got a book on rewilding, read into it as far as an ecological restoration philosophy. So I got this book, if anybody's interested. It's called The Book of Wilding by Isabella Tree and Charlie Burrell. There's a bunch of books on this. That's just the one that I happened to get my paws on. And one of the things that really struck me from that book is talking about the role of herbivores. And this book is written by British people. So it's kind of more from a European context, which is really different actually than where we are, just because they're a different history of land use. I just had this realization of like foragers' role, like people who forage plants and mushrooms, is kind of like an herbivore in a way in the ecosystem. Like deer munch at things and like foragers munch at things in their own way. So to me, there's a couple ramifications of that idea. One of them is that the unique thing about humans is that we can be selective and intelligent herbivores. Deer will just eat and eat and eat. If you go to the San Juan Islands, there's so many deer there that you go into the forest and it's like foxglove and cedar, because deer don't like that. That's it. Like it's just perfectly manicured, like nothing, no growth in some of the areas. I'm thinking of Orcas Island, an experience that I had there. But humans can actually look at the consequences of their actions and choose differently. And that is the unique thing about us as humans. That requires education and awareness. And it also requires a mind of maybe looking at the collective good and not your selfish gain. But that is what's unique about us. And so our ecological role to me, and this is why I talk so much about harvesting weeds and harvesting invasive plants, is that we can go in and choose, oh, this is so abundant in this particular spot, like I'm going to harvest this. Or we can go in and be like, ooh, I like this plant a lot. I want to use it as medicine, but it's rare and it's struggling in this environment and we can choose not to harvest it. So to me, that's kind of like foragers can help a selective pressure in that we can remove vegetation that needs to be removed and we can leave things alone. Deer don't have that, right? Deer are just going to eat anything. So are rabbits. So are elk. We have a lot of elk in our area. So yeah, I'm getting a little lost in the weeds, so to speak here.
Good thought, honestly, because and a lot of plants too are locally abundant, but just across the board, we think of them as kind of rare or even threatened or just kind of scarce.
I can give you two concrete examples of how interesting
Okay, let's go.
First one is eyebright, which is Euphrasia. I can't remember the species name. It's considered invasive in Washington. You're actually not allowed to ship eyebright plant material to Washington State. It's a little tiny plant that you would probably miss. Yeah. It grows on like the sides of Forest Service roads. It's literally 3 inches tall. And it's considered invasive in Washington State. If you look at the United Plant Savers, which is an organization that conserves medicinal plants there in Ohio, it's on the endangered list. So if that's really interesting. And then what else is on the endangered list, according to the United Plant Savers, is Oregon grape. And that's because in other areas of the country, it is indeed very rare. But here in Washington State, right?
Yeah, it's totally dominant. It's like
It's
one of the big,
rather
yeah,
abundant.
it's one of the big three with like sword fern and salal, honestly. Yeah. So you see a lot of it.
It is really interesting that this is a very localized thing.
You mentioned hawthorn earlier too, and it's one of those ones where anywhere we have a lot of shade or bigger forests, like you really don't see hawthorn.
You'll see it, but it's not healthy.
Yeah, going crazy or even flowering or fruiting. So it's pretty scarce. But then in patches of places, I would say in particular, I see it in places where the military had an occupation for a little while, like in these former military installations, for in Seattle anyway, people are familiar with like Discovery Park or Magnuson Park. There are these like copses of hawthorn.
Stands, maybe?
Yeah, the stands of hawthorn, and a couple spots, like I'm wondering, people would look at it and be like, it's taking over. But really, it's just really these isolated, like locally abundant spots of just like a few acres, really, amongst like thousands of acres.
Yeah, and again, I don't think that there is a right answer to this, but if we take Magnuson Park, for example, yeah, there are like whole fields full of it. And guess what it's competing with? Himalayan blackberry. And unless we were to really go in there and do a full-on like native plant replacement and removed all the hawthorn, which could be really good, like the birds would probably enjoy that. And there is a really amazing restoration project that they did in Magnuson Park. I'm sure you know about it. It was very expensive, but it's like amazing. They have ponds. They planted all these native plants. Birds love it. If we were going to do that, then great. But I think that people see something, they just want to remove it. And my problem with that is that they don't necessarily have a plan of what's going in there instead. For example, like at Magnuson Park, one of my favorite stands of hawthorn, the parks department just killed the entire thing. And then they were just like dead trees standing there. And it's, and the dead trees I think are still there, actually, 4 or 5 years later. And that's a lot of dead tree material to just be standing there. So I guess, and also at Magnuson Park, I've witnessed cedar waxwings, which is a native bird, eating hawthorn berries at the park. And I've actually seen squirrels eating hawthorn berries and all kinds of other birds. I'm curious, as an herbalist, is there a better way to discourage hawthorn from growing in places where it is negatively impacting something? And maybe we can quantify that. And then maybe leave the hawthorns that aren't impacting or replace them with native hawthorns. I just feel like there's a better solution somewhere. And I'm curious about what that better solution is. And I'm also curious to hear your thoughts on this topic.
So I think the big picture, I think, is the historical context. Again, right before it was a park, obviously like Magnuson, the area where Magnuson Park is, or Sandpoint, it was native land before that. But at some point it was a military installation. It was actually like an airstrip. Before that, even like the lake level is modulated by the locks, right? So it was actually partially underwater at some point in time. The military was there and it was an airstrip. So like super compacted, probably portions of that are very polluted. So hawthorn maybe was introduced there. And again, it's a place that's pretty locally abundant because it is pretty big green space of a couple hundred acres. So like lots of birds. It's on the Pacific Flyway. You see cedar waxwings, I guess, perhaps, or a specialty of eating bigger berries and seeds and probably spread it across these areas of like predominantly like grassland. I also think about that word rewilding that you used and sort of the tension around the word wild. And we think about what we're restoring to perhaps is something that of some privileging some snapshot in time. We're trying to restore it back to like what it was, but we really don't know what it was. And it's probably drastically changed. And we can't turn back the clock really. But our conceptions of what wild is like something that's like untouched by people or somewhat pristine. And it just has a lot of baggage associated with it. And landscapes, a lot of time we disregard, as settlers anyway, we disregard like how indigenous folks like curated basically the landscape and moving plants around and like burning things. And we just don't do that in really park spaces anymore, or in a lot of landscapes, because we've removed fire from the landscape, removed big carnivores or herbivores. So there's just things that are missing. There's things that are just out of relationship with the way they were. So those are a lot of rambling thoughts I have about that. But
those are some good thoughts, though. I think that the getting back to what it was in my opinion, I think a better philosophy or approach might be to embrace what is a little bit more, because it's so many steps removed from a forest or a pristine pre-colonial wetland. There's so many things that make that picture a very difficult picture to return to. And one might question too, like, why do we need that? So I'm curious, with the hawthorns, we have a part of Magnuson Park that has been restored to what was there before, for the benefit of animals. And let me tell you, that's been amazing, because I go in there and just see all kinds of animals doing all kinds of things and using it for what it was intended for, which is beautiful and great. That said, there's so much of the park that's like hawthorns and cottonwoods and rose bushes and blackberries and hardhack, which is the rose family plant. And there is also an ecology happening there. There's rabbits, there's robins, there's cedar waxwings, there's mice, there's squirrels, raccoons, crows. It might not be the ecology that we want. I'm doing air quotes, but it is still an ecology that is full of living things living their lives. And it is a wetland too, which is like a seasonal wetland. So there's water seasonally there. As somebody obviously who's not educated in that, like, I am curious if we can explore that particular park, like leaving that and managing it to be what it is, which is a field with various types of trees with a wetland habitat.
In my mind, I think it is just recognizing the benefits that hawthorn provides, right?
Mhm.
Sarah Butters said several times that like certain plants or different things show up on the landscape when we need them most. So obviously, like personally, myself, I've been known to have high blood pressure and high cholesterol. So for me,
And you're not
hawthorn, I
alone.
think is very important. I share that with a lot of folks that live in the community. It is important weighing that benefit versus whatever impact we think it might be having. In the stands of the hawthorn there's like incredibly unique, let's say, epiphytes too, like growing on the trees. Even this
Mhm.
crazy biocrust underneath. Seasonally, it's flooded. And so there's like all these crazy mosses and lichens underneath as well. So if people pursue the de facto clearing of the hawthorn, like again, just how easy it is to remove things, but then what we
Yeah.
build back, we're not so good at. And I think we have to co-create that together with people who really love the space and like the long term and thinking beyond just a few
Mhm.
years and thinking about it over decades, honestly.
Yeah. I want to bring up the South Puget Sound prairies. When I studied with Federica Boquet, that is one of the areas that we really focused on in our studies. So I ended up learning a lot about it. And a lot of people don't know that we have these West Side prairies in Western Washington that have historically been really culturally important, in that canvas, one of the most important indigenous foods of Native groups all over its range. And those prairies have been, I don't remember the exact statistics, so I'm not going to try to cite it, but I want to say around only 6% of those prairies remain by area. And that's really sad. And one of the reasons that's sad is because there's a bunch of now rare plants that are endangered because of that. Golden paintbrush being the poster child of that, but also the Taylor's checker spot butterfly, which relies on camas. And you can look at also like rice root, which is also like just a lot more rare now. Trillium ovatum is another plant that has become super rare because the prairies are disappearing. And the reason that the prairies are disappearing is because agriculture has basically reclaimed that land for cows. So like they introduced a bunch of non-native grasses. Scotch broom has done a lot of damage in there. Douglas fir trees actually are considered invasive in Puget Sound prairies, which is interesting because they encroach on prairie land. And so the native practices of prescribed burning in these areas were outlawed actually back in the day. And they're now being reintroduced, and tribes are just now being allowed to do it again. And a lot of those plants relied on that seasonal burn for their cycle, right? Maybe they needed the smoke to germinate, or they needed the fire to eliminate the weeds or the Douglas fir trees. So there's all these endemic species that live in this place, and it's disappearing. And so there's actually like Glacial Heritage Preserve has this really great thing, which I think will still be happening after this podcast gets released. It's called Prairie Appreciation Day at Glacial Heritage Preserve. It's amazing. You can go see all the projects that they've been doing restoring the prairies. So this is all to say restoration efforts can be amazing. And they do have really important effects. And that does involve removing some species, and that does involve introducing prescribed burning, and that does involve like some heavier handed human intervention to protect these species. So I think that I'm like split. I think traditional ecological restoration has a really important role in preserving some of these disappearing habitats. But I also think we as colonists have impacted this area to the point where a lot of the systems aren't going to recover. And so we do need to embrace maybe the emergent systems to some extent. That's what I have to say.
Really great perspective. That's cool. It's so close, but yet so far. The prairies, I'm a little closer to them than you are, I guess. We'll plug Prairie Appreciation Day. It is coming up pretty soon.
Mm-hmm.
Amazing.
It's pretty amazing to go see the camas blooming.
Yeah.
And you can see the mounds. So the Maima mounds are kind of these famous, like mysterious, big, rounded mounds that we have in our prairies. If you're a plant nerd or an ecological or any kind of nerd like that, you got to go.
And it's so distinct from what we usually think of like our big Douglas fir forests or whatever. So yeah, it's cool. Well, I'm going to switch gears here. Are you up for a few rapid fire questions?
Sure.
Okay. All right. I hope this isn't too intimidating. Just to find out a little bit more about you. Okay, ready?
Mm-hmm.
I heard you were an ESL teacher at one point in time. Do you have a favorite word in another language?
Oh, man. That's a really hard question. Here we go. I've got one.
Okay.
I am a very good Japanese speaker, and my favorite Japanese word is onomatopoetic words that are like adjectives, but they sound like what they are. And there's this texture, this food texture in Japan called neba neba, which is, you imagine you're chewing on something kind of chewy, maybe not in a good way, and it's like neba neba between your teeth. But that's what they actually call, it's a word that they call that texture.
That's great.
So anyway.
Okay, good one. Do you have a mundane skill or habit that gets you through or sets the tone for the day?
Oh, interesting. Interestingly enough, so I work for myself, as many of us do have attention issues. So I'm actually really good at dealing with my energy in my workday and my attention. So one of the things I do when I'm writing my book, to bring it back to the book a little bit, I will write until I can feel in my body when I'm done and when the inspiration has left me. And I will stop when I feel that feeling. And then I will go maybe on a walk or maybe have a snack or take a shower or talk to a friend or whatever it is. And then I can feel that inspiration coming back and I'll just drop whatever I'm doing and just go for it. So I think my mundane skill is being very aware of what can happen in that moment as far as my ability.
All right. I will accept that answer. However, that sounds like a superpower. What is one thing you can't live without as an herbalist?
I'm going to interpret that like an herb that I can't live without. And this is not a native plant, so I feel kind of bad about saying this. But white peony root is a Chinese herb. And I have terrible restless leg syndrome. And that is the only thing that will make it go away. So I take this, I think it's called Shan Yao Gansao Tong. It's a Chinese formula.
Mm-hmm.
I take it twice a day. And if I don't take it, my leg will just be like all night long.
Really? Okay. I've heard about restless leg syndrome.
I can't live without that.
All right. Perfect.
That's it.
As an herbalist, what item is worth spending more money on than other things?
Oh my gosh. That's like such a big question. As you can see, short answers are not a cup of tea. I think that people undervalue the quality of their herbs. And I think spending money on high quality herbs is really important because I worked in an herb store for a long time. And sometimes we would get low quality herbs just because that's what the herb company had. And it'd be like brown and also had a bunch of stem in it. And it's not going to work as well if it's not good quality. If you want herbs to be effective, they need to actually have the constituents in there and be the right part of the plant and harvested at the right time and dry well. So, yeah.
Good. Okay. Do you have a favorite song about plants? You can Google it right now if you want.
I will say, so singing songs about plants is a big thing among herbalists. I am not musical and I have a terrible memory for songs. So unfortunately, that one passed me by. But I will say that one of my original teachers, I'll give a little shout out, Michael Pilarski, also known as Skeeter, who runs Friends of the Trees Botanicals. He has some videos, I think, on YouTube where he sings some plant songs. And he's just like one of those song guys who's just always making up songs about things. he has some songs that I can't remember now, but they're like so simple, but just like super endearing about like harvesting and let's sing about hawthorn and different things like that. So if you are interested in some of that, you can look as a YouTube channel.
Yeah, maybe you can send me a link to them and I put in the show notes. Yeah, Skeeter singing. Okay. Favorite month or season for foraging?
Oh, I think May is my favorite season because there's kind of the most different things you can harvest. Rose flowers you can harvest. And the smell of rose is just like one of my favorite things in the entire world. And then you can also harvest like pine, spruce, Douglas fir tips in that season as well, which is also one of my favorite things. And then there's also just lots of like green things and flowers. And there's just so much going on in May that if I could just forage in May and not do anything else, like I'd be a happy gal.
Okay, good one. This may be the last one. What is a good, safe place for like a first date for herbalists? If you're looking for love.
First forage.
Herbalism love.
You mean like people are looking for an herbalist to date or people want to like go for their first foraging spot?
Oh, I don't know. You can interpret it either way.
I mean, herb conferences are where all the herbalists go. I'll plug the Northwest Herbal Fair, which is happening, I believe, August 15th through 18th this year. Northwest Herbal Fair 2024. It's an herb conference. There's herb conferences all over the country. So you can find one in your area. But that would probably be what I'd recommend because that's where anybody who's anybody in herbalism interested will go.
Super. Congratulations. So before we leave today, how can people find out more about you? Where can they find the book?
Yeah, so I run a school, which I didn't mention earlier, called the Adiantum School of Plant Medicine. Adiantumschool.com is my website. I'm on Facebook under that name, and I'm on Instagram. Adiantum School is my Instagram name. The book can be purchased at mountaineers.com. Most major booksellers should have it, and then a lot of bookstores will be carrying it as well. I'm doing a book event in Seward Park at Third Place Books in Seattle on April 18th at 7 p.m. if anybody wants to join, and they will be selling my book there as well.
Nice. I know that spot. That's right.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite bookstores.
They have like bagels and stuff.
Yeah, there's a little cafe there. It's where the PCC used to be in Seward Park.
That's right. Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you so much for your time. I learned a lot.
Thank you.
It was a great conversation.
Yeah, loved it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's great to meet you. Yeah, and good luck. And hopefully people will read the book when it comes out. We'll put some links in the show notes about where to find it and everything. And the Adiantum School, like you do walks and classes and online stuff too, right?
Yeah, I teach basket weaving. I do foraging walks. I do herbalism classes online sometimes. So check out my website for any of that. One last thing, I'm actually writing a second book about edible plants in the Pacific Northwest, which will also be a visual guide. And that's coming out in August of 2025. I'm working hard on that right now.
Getting after it. Holy moly.
All right.
That's great.
Guys.
Good talk. Thanks for joining me again for another episode of Tree Hugger Podcast. I'm Michael Yadrick. Be sure to check out the show notes for more information about our guest, Natalie Hammerquist. You can find her through her website and socials linked in the show description. Natalie will be presenting her new book, Medicinal Plants of the Pacific Northwest, a visual guide to harvesting and healing with 35 common species at Third Place Books in Seward Park on Thursday, April 18th at 7 p.m. Attendees will have the opportunity to participate in a public signing and Q&A session. As an independent podcast, your support means everything. If you'd like to contribute to help cover the small overhead costs of the show, you can donate via PayPal, Venmo, and Cash App. You can find the archive of this episode and more online at treehuggerpod.com. Connect with us on social media at treehuggerpod, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the show on your favorite podcast platform. Your support helps others discover the podcast. And if you enjoy what you hear, don't hesitate to tell a friend about us. Thanks for hanging out. Until next time, see you in the woods.